The screen glowed at 2:14 a.m., a harsh blue rectangle in the absolute darkness of my bedroom. My eyes burned, gritty with exhaustion. I was staring at the interface for the new mobile app, specifically the input field highlight. It was too subtle. Users would miss it. I opened the message thread with Rachel. It was strictly professional, a log of file transfers and brief approvals. I typed quickly, my thumbs moving on muscle memory, intending to write, "The focus state is clunky." That was the technical critique. That was the thought. But exhaustion makes you clumsy, and autocorrect is a cruel editor. I hit send before I proofread. The message bubble turned blue. "Your focus is my undoing." The blood drained from my face so fast I felt dizzy. It wasn't just a typo. It was a confession I didn't even know I was making. And right below it, the terrifying, immediate receipt. Read. To understand the sheer, cold horror of that moment, you have to understand Rachel Paul. She isn't just a creative director. She is an architect of behavior. She has a reputation for absolute, terrifying precision. In the industry, they say she can spot a misaligned pixel from across the room. I believe them. For the last 3 months, our dynamic has been defined by the sterile, air-conditioned silence of her headquarters. Her office is a glass cube suspended above the financial district, a space so devoid of clutter it feels like a vacuum. When I present there, I feel like a specimen under a microscope. She sits at the head of the table, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. She speaks in low, controlled tones that force you to lean in. "Reduce the friction," she says. "Simplify the path." She treats the user experience like a Japanese garden. Everything must be intentional. Nothing can be extraneous. The project is a complete digital overhaul for Lumina, a luxury lifestyle brand that sells minimalism to billionaires. The stakes are incredibly high. If this launch fails, the brand loses its edge in a saturated market. If it succeeds, my career is made. I've been working 18-hour days to match her standards. My apartment has become a graveyard of coffee cups and takeout containers. I live in sweatpants. I haven't seen a friend in weeks. I exist in the glow of my monitor, obsessed with kerning and hex codes, trying to predict what Rachel will want before she asks for it. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable. I imagine the email arriving at dawn. Contract terminated, effective immediately. I imagine the legal team. Harassment suit pending. Rachel Paul doesn't tolerate mistakes. She certainly doesn't tolerate unprofessional, emotionally charged outbursts at 2 a.m. from a freelancer she barely tolerates. The sun came up, a gray, unforgiving light that exposed the dust on my floorboards and the chaos of my living space. I showered. I dressed in my most serious clothes, a crisp button-down and slacks, even though I had nowhere to go. I sat at my desk, my hands hovering over the keyboard, unable to write a single line of code. The silence from her end was heavy. It had texture. It was a physical weight pressing down on the room. At 9 a.m., I checked my email. Nothing. At 9:15 a.m., I checked Slack. Green dot, active. No messages. The waiting was a specific kind of torture. It was the feeling of standing on a trap door, waiting for the lever to pull. Then, at 9:43 a.m., the phone buzzed against the wood of the desk. The sound was loud in the quiet apartment. Violent. I stared at it for a full 10 seconds before I picked it up. A text message. From Rachel. I unlocked the screen, bracing myself for the firing squad. The office is undergoing emergency renovations. The drilling is unacceptable for concentration. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Okay. A reprieve. A logical explanation. Then the second message came through. We need a controlled environment for the final review. A third bubble appeared. 3 dancing dots that held my fate. Your apartment. 10 a.m. My apartment. I looked around. The unmade bed visible from the desk. The stack of laundry on the chair. The half-eaten bagel on the counter. The general atmosphere of a woman who had abandoned all domestic dignity for a deadline. My apartment? I typed back, my fingers stiff. Send the address, she replied instantly. I'm in the car. 17 minutes. That wasn't a timeline. It was a countdown to a controlled demolition. I moved with the frantic, silent energy of a criminal scrubbing a crime scene. The half-eaten bagel vanished into the trash. The laundry, a humiliating pile of gray sweatpants and oversized t-shirts, didn't get folded. It got exiled to the bottom of the closet, the door jammed shut with a prayer. I wasn't just cleaning. I was trying to erase the evidence of my humanity. I opened the window, letting the sharp city air scour the room. I straightened the stack of design annuals on the coffee table, arranging them with a geometry I hoped mimicked hers. Standing in the center of the room, breathing hard, I realized the true weight of the request. The glass walls of her office had been my protection. They were a neutral zone, a sterile buffer where I was just a vendor and she was just a checkbook. There, I was a cursor on a screen. Here, surrounded by my books, my dying fern, the specific slant of light that hit my rug at 10 a.m., I was a person. She wasn't just coming to a meeting. She was migrating into my private data. The buzzer rang at 10 o'clock exactly. Of course it did. Rachel Paul does not arrive early, and she certainly does not arrive late. She arrives precisely when the world aligns for her. My hand shook as I pressed the intercom button. Come up. I listened to the heavy, rhythmic click of heels on the hardwood of the hallway outside. It sounded like a metronome counting down. When the knock came, 2 sharp raps, I took a breath that rattled in my chest and opened the door. The visual shock of her was immediate. In the context of her high-rise office, Rachel made sense. She blended with the chrome and the glass. But here, framed by my chipped door frame, standing on my scuffed welcome mat, she looked like a diamond dropped into a basket of wool. She was wearing a charcoal trench coat belted tightly at the waist, the collar turned up against the wind. Her hair was pulled back in that severe architectural knot that exposed the long, elegant line of her neck. She looked expensive, sharp, and dangerously out of place. "Rachel," I said. My voice sounded thin in the hallway. She didn't smile. Her eyes, the color of cool slate, swept over me. They cataloged the button-down shirt I'd hastily thrown on, the dampness of my hair, the slight flush of panic on my skin. "May I?" I stepped back, pulling the door wide. "Of course, please." She stepped across the threshold, and the atmosphere in the room instantly recalibrated. The air grew heavier, charged with a sudden static tension. She brought the scent of the city with her, cold rain, pavement, and beneath that, the faint signature of sandalwood. It was a scent that didn't ask for attention, but demanded it. I closed the door, and the click of the latch sounded incredibly final. We were alone, in my apartment. The text message, "Your focus is my undoing," felt like a third person standing in the room between us, breathing down my neck. I waited for her to bring it up. I waited for the cold dismissal, the professional reprimand, the demand for an explanation. She didn't speak. Instead, she walked to the center of the living room, bypassing the small dining table I had set up as a workspace. She kept her coat on. She turned slowly, taking it in. She looked at the wall of books, organized by color because I needed visual order to think. She looked at the velvet armchair I dragged from the curb and reupholstered. She looked at the morning light filtering through the sheer curtains, softening the hard edges of the city outside. Her silence was a physical thing. It stretched tight, like a wire about to snap. I stood by the door, my hands clasped behind my back to stop them from fidgeting, feeling like an intruder in my own home. Finally, she turned back to me. Her expression was unreadable, but her shoulders seemed to drop, just a fraction of an inch. "The light," she said, her voice low. "It's better here." I blinked. "It's south-facing." "It's not sterile," she corrected. She walked over to the window and ran a finger along the sill, checking for dust I prayed I hadn't missed. Then she looked at the room again, her gaze lingering on the soft throw blanket draped over the sofa. "The office is a vacuum. It's good for decisions, bad for intuition. This," she gestured vaguely with a gloved hand, "this has texture." She turned to face me fully, and for a second, the boardroom mask slipped. There was curiosity there, raw and unflinching. "I didn't expect you to live somewhere so warm." The word hung in the air. Warm. It felt like an accusation and a compliment wrapped in one. "I like to be comfortable," I managed to say, the defense weak. Rachel watched me for a beat longer than necessary. Comfort is usually the enemy of progress, she said softly. Then she reached up and began to undo the belt of her trench coat. The sound of the fabric sliding against itself was loud in the quiet room. But perhaps, in this case, we can make an exception. She shed the coat, draping it over my armchair with a familiarity that made my stomach flip. She was wearing a sleeveless silk blouse underneath, revealing the tone of her arms, the unexpected vulnerability of bare skin in my drafty apartment. She had claimed the space. My apartment wasn't mine anymore. It was an outpost of her world, and I was just living in it. We didn't use the table. That was the first deviation from protocol. In her office, we sat at opposite ends of a 10-foot marble slab, separated by a gulf of corporate hierarchy. Here, the geography was compressed. Rachel bypassed the dining chair I had pulled out for her and moved to the sofa. She sank into the velvet, crossing her legs with a fluid grace that made my thrifted furniture look expensive. "The screen glares better here," she stated, patting the cushion beside her. It wasn't an invitation, it was a directive. But I couldn't bring myself to sit next to her. The proximity felt dangerous. The air around her was too rarefied. So I sat on the floor, on the rug, my back against the coffee table, the iPad Pro balanced on my knees. It was a position of submission, looking up at her, but it felt safer than the alternative. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, bringing her face down to my level. The distance between us collapsed to inches. I could see the grain of her skin, the faint pale scar near her hairline that the boardroom lighting always washed out. I could smell her perfume filling the space between us. "Show me the navigation flow," she commanded. I unlocked the tablet. My hands were steady, a feat of will. I swiped through the wireframes, the bright screen illuminating our faces in the dim room. I tightened the animation speed, I explained, my voice sounding rough in my own ears. It felt sluggish before. Now it snaps. "Snaps," she repeated. She watched the screen, but I felt her awareness on me. Precision is about removing the delay between thought and action. The user shouldn't have to wait for the interface to catch up to their desire. Desire. The word landed heavy in the room. In a strategy meeting, it meant conversion rates. Here, in the quiet of my living room, with the rain starting to tap against the glass, it meant something else entirely. The memory of my text message throbbed in the silence like a second heartbeat. She hadn't mentioned it. She hadn't acknowledged it. But it was there, woven into the subtext of every critique. "Go back," she said. I hesitated. "To the home screen?" "To the input field." My stomach tightened. The input field. The place where the accident happened. I navigated back. The cursor blinked on the screen, a rhythmic pulse. "The active state," she murmured, leaning closer. A loose strand of hair escaped her knot. "It needs to be more distinct. When they touch it, they need to know the system has them. They need to feel held." I swallowed hard. "I can increase the drop shadow, add a glow." "No." She reached out. Her hand, cool and manicured, hovered over the glass. She wasn't pointing. She was tracing the path of the user. "It's not about decoration. It's about feedback." I reached out to zoom in on the element, just as she lowered her hand to tap it. Our fingers collided. It was a circuit closing. The contact was brief, the side of her index finger against the pad of my thumb, but the shock of it traveled all the way up my arm. It was haptic feedback made flesh. The air in the room seemed to vanish. I didn't pull away immediately. I couldn't. And she didn't either. Her finger lingered against mine, cool skin against warm, pressing down on the glass surface that separated the digital perfection from the messy, breathing reality of us. For 5 seconds, nobody breathed. The only sound was the blood rushing in my ears. She was looking at the screen, but her focus was entirely on the point of contact. "Do you feel that?" she asked. Her voice had dropped. It had lost the projection she used for boardrooms. It was quiet, raspy, a voice meant for the dark. The tap target?" I stammered, willfully misunderstanding, desperate to retreat to the safety of jargon. She turned her head, her eyes locked onto mine, unflinching. The distance was negligible. If I leaned forward 3 inches, "The friction," she said softly. "It's too high. We need to smooth it out." She pulled her hand back slowly, the separation feeling like a physical loss. She sat back, the professional mask sliding back into place, though it fit less perfectly. "Fix the state," she said, her gaze returning to the window. "Make it seamless." We worked for another hour, but the dynamic had shifted. The professional hierarchy had been breached by the intimacy of the space and the electricity of that touch. When she finally stood to leave, gathering her coat, the impression of her weight remained on my sofa cushions, a ghost of her presence that stayed long after the door clicked shut. The apartment felt too big, too empty, and entirely, terrifyingly changed. It started as a temporary patch, a workaround for the noise. But temporary solutions have a habit of becoming permanent features. My apartment became the operational hub. Every morning at 10 a.m., the buzzer rang. It was the only clock I needed. Rachel Paul walked into my life, and the rest of the world simply rendered out of existence. The transformation of the space, and of us, was gradual, a slow erosion of the boundaries I had relied on. The first week, the protocol was strict. By the second week, the heels were the first casualty. I found them abandoned by the door, black stilettos lying on my cheap laminate flooring like sculptural art. Seeing Rachel in her stocking feet felt illicit, a back-end access code she had quietly shared with me. Then the blazer vanished. Seeing her in just a silk camisole felt dangerous. She wasn't less intimidating. The softness made her more lethal. It signaled comfort, and comfort implied she wasn't planning to leave. She began to colonize my domesticity. It wasn't an invasion. It was an integration. I walked into the kitchen one Tuesday to find her boiling water. She had opened the wrong cupboard, finding my chaotic stash of herbal teas. She was smelling a jar of jasmine. "The water pressure in your sink is inconsistent," she noted, not opening her eyes. "It's a pre-war building," I said, leaning against the doorframe, watching her navigate my kitchen with terrifying ease. "The pipes have mood swings. It adds texture," she decided, spooning tea into the infuser. She made 2 cups. She didn't ask. She simply placed the ceramic mug on the table next to my laptop. The steam curled between us, carrying the scent of flowers and rain. She critiqued my books with the ruthlessness she applied to typography. She pulled a paperback off the shelf, read the back, and raised an eyebrow. "Escapism," she diagnosed, sliding it back. "You prefer the mess of emotion to the cleanliness of logic." "I prefer stories where people say what they mean," I countered, the words risky, sharp. She looked at me then, her hand still resting on the spine of the book. "Do you?" Our language shifted. We were talking about the app, but the metaphors bled into the room until I couldn't tell the difference. We argued about desire paths, the routes users take because they want to, not because they're designed to. "You can't force the user to follow the grid," I argued one afternoon. "They want the shortcut. They want the direct line to what they need." Rachel looked at the screen, then slowly turned to look at me. Her gaze was heavy. It had physical weight. It wasn't the critical scan of a creative director anymore. It was the hunger of someone tired of the grid. "And what if the direct line is destructive?" she asked. Her voice was low, a hum in the quiet room. "What if the shortcut breaks the system?" "Then you build better guardrails," I said, my voice wavering under the intensity of her focus. "Or," she said, leaning in until I could smell the sandalwood and the silence, "you remove the obstacles and let them crash." The fear of being fired evaporated, replaced by a volatile anxiety. I wasn't afraid she would leave. I was terrified she wouldn't. The text message, "Your focus is my undoing," was the elephant in the room we decided to treat as a pet. We fed it with lingering glances and accidental touches. I'd look up to find her studying my profile with an intensity that made my skin prickle. It wasn't the scrutiny of a boss looking for a flaw. It was the focus of a collector, deciding exactly where I fit. Then came the shift. The launch date was pushed up by 2 weeks. The luxury market waits for no one. "We need to accelerate," Rachel said, checking her phone. The calm mask tightened. "The timeline just collapsed. We can't do this 9 to 5 anymore." "What does that mean?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. She looked at the darkening window, then back at me, her eyes dark. "It means we enter night mode." The city outside ceased to exist. First, the traffic noise died, fading from a roar to a hum, then to nothing. Then the lights in the building across the alley winked out, one by one. until my apartment was a solitary capsule drifting in the dark. We were running on adrenaline and the kind of exhaustion that strips the nerves bare, leaving everything raw and hypersensitive. It was 2 a.m. We had been working for 16 hours straight. The air in the room was recycled, thick with the scent of cooling coffee and the heat coming off the laptop. The boundaries of the project had dissolved. We weren't just building an interface anymore. We were inhabiting a shared hallucination of perfection. Rachel had abandoned the sofa hours ago. She was sitting on the floor now, her back against the armchair, her long legs stretched out on the rug. The transformation was complete. The creative director who terrified boardrooms was gone. In her place was a woman with ink stains on her fingertips and a loose strand of hair falling into her eyes. A woman who looked devastatingly human. She had unbuttoned the cuffs of her silk shirt and rolled them up, exposing her wrists. It was a small detail, but in the intimacy of the night, it felt like nudity. "We need food," she announced, her voice raspy. She didn't look up from the sketch pad where she was redesigning the checkout flow by hand. My brain is eating itself. We ordered dumplings from the only place still open. When they arrived, we didn't move to the table. We ate on the floor, the curtains sitting between us on the Persian rug like a campfire. There was something ancient and illicit about it, breaking bread in the dark while the rest of the world slept. The professional distance that usually protected us was too heavy to maintain this late. It slipped off our shoulders like a heavy coat. "You live like a monk," she observed, gesturing with a chopstick at my sparse living room. "Or a fugitive. I can't decide which." "I live like someone who works for you," I countered, stabbing a dumpling. She laughed, a low, throaty sound that vibrated in my chest. "I'm not that bad. I just demand clarity." She looked at me then, chewing slowly, her eyes reflecting the screen's glow. "Why do you do it? You take the abuse. You haven't slept in 3 days. Most freelancers would have quit after the first critique." "I want the work to be good," I said. It was the safe answer. "Liar," she said softly. "You want to be seen." The truth of it hung in the air, uncomfortably accurate. She set her carton down and leaned back, her head resting against the velvet chair, exposing the long line of her throat. She looked tired, but the intensity in her eyes hadn't dimmed. It had just focused. She held my gaze for a second longer, a second that felt like an hour, before she straightened up, the moment snapping shut like a book. "Back to work," she commanded, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "The final prototype won't build itself." She moved closer to the screen, her shoulder brushing mine, the heat of her body radiating through the silk. The distance was gone. We were just two bodies in the dark, undone by the work, and terrifyingly close to the truth. The launch event was held in a converted industrial space in Chelsea. Vast, echoing, and intimidatingly white. It was the physical manifestation of the brand we had spent months building. Minimalist, expensive, and cold. I stood near a pillar, clutching lukewarm champagne, feeling like a glitch in the system. I was wearing a black dress that felt too thin for the air conditioning, watching the industry elite circulate like sharks in a tank, waiting for the main attraction. And then there was Rachel. Seeing corporate Rachel again after weeks of apartment Rachel was a psychological shock. It was like looking at the front-end interface after spending a month deep in the back-end code. She stood in the center of the room, surrounded by investors and tech journalists. She was wearing a white suit so sharp it could cut glass, her hair pulled back into that severe, perfect knot. She was radiant, terrifying, and completely untouchable. I watched her laugh at a joke from a CEO. It was a precise, calibrated sound. Nothing like the throaty, exhausted laugh she had released in my living room at 3 a.m. She moved with calculated grace, her hand resting lightly on the arm of a potential client, guiding him through the demo stations. To everyone else in this room, she was Rachel Paul, the icon, the visionary, the ice queen. But I looked at her and saw the ink stain on her finger she'd scrubbed at for 10 minutes. I saw the way her shoulders held tension when she was tired. I saw the woman who sat on my floor in stocking feet and admitted she wanted to break the grid. The dissonance made me dizzy. It was a violent possessiveness, the knowledge that I held the encryption key to the woman everyone else was just looking at. She must have felt my gaze. In the middle of a sentence, she stopped. She turned her head, scanning the periphery of the room with laser focus. Her eyes found mine instantly. The connection was audible, a snap of static in the crowded room. For a second, the smile dropped. The polished facade slipped, revealing the raw intensity of the nights we'd spent working. She didn't wave, she didn't smile, she just looked at me, anchoring herself to the one real thing in the room. Then a man in a velvet blazer, a competitor from a rival agency, stepped into her line of sight, blocking me. He leaned in too close, placing a hand on her elbow, flirting with the confidence of someone who thinks they are an equal. I felt a spike of hot, irrational anger. I wanted to walk over there and tell him he didn't have the clearance, but Rachel handled it with the efficiency of a firewall blocking malware. She didn't step back. She just froze. She turned that cool, slate gaze on him and said something brief. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the result. His smile faltered. He removed his hand as if he'd been burned. She nodded once, dismissively, and turned away, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his own ego. 10 minutes later, I felt a presence beside me, in a quiet alcove near the emergency exit. If I have to explain the concept of negative space to one more venture capitalist, Rachel's voice murmured, I'm going to set this building on fire. I didn't turn immediately. You look like you're enjoying it. You're very convincing. It's a performance, she said. She stepped closer, invading my personal space, shielding us from the room with her back. Her voice dropped, losing the boardroom projection, sinking into the raspy, intimate register she used only in my apartment. It's the user interface. It's what they expect. But the back end... She paused, and I could feel the heat of her arm near mine. The back end is crashing. I want to go. I want to be back in the quiet. With you. The drive back was a blur of city lights streaking across the tinted windows of her town car. We didn't speak. The silence wasn't empty. It was pressurized. We sat on opposite sides of the leather seat, separated by a foot of space that felt charged with electricity. Every time the car turned, our knees brushed, and neither of us pulled away. The contrast between the public spectacle and this private containment was overwhelming. We were hurtling back toward the source of the gravity, back to the apartment, back to the night mode. The car stopped. I looked at her. Come up, I said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she answered. Returning felt inevitable, like a script executing its final command. Let's go home. The storm broke the moment we crossed the threshold, a violent downpour turning the city into a blurred watercolor. We sat on the floor, ostensibly to review metrics, but the pretense was thin. The laptop screen hummed between us, displaying graphs neither of us was reading. The retention curve was up, the bounce rate was down. Professional success was glowing in neon green, right there on the display. But it felt distant, like news from a foreign country. The real metric, the only one that mattered, was the distance between her knee and mine. 3 inches of negative space that felt charged enough to power the entire block. The user flow held up, I said, pointing at a dip in the graph. My voice sounded too loud, too brittle in the quiet room. We didn't lose them at checkout. We didn't lose them, Rachel repeated. She wasn't looking at the graph. She was watching my hand hover over the trackpad. Efficiency. Then the building groaned. The lights flickered. Once, twice. A strobe effect that froze her face in flashes of stark, beautiful illumination. Then, with a heavy mechanical thunk, the power died. The refrigerator hummed and died. The router blinked off. The apartment plunged into a heavy, suffocating darkness, broken only by the cold blue light of the laptop screen and the faint amber wash of streetlights filtering through the rain-streaked window. The silence that followed was absolute. System failure, I whispered, the joke falling flat in the charged air. Rachel didn't laugh. In the blue glow, her eyes looked black. The shadows carved sharp angles into her face, stripping away the softness of the apartment Rachel and returning some of the creative director intensity, but focused entirely on me. The sudden darkness didn't frighten her. It seemed to empower her. It stripped away the last of the office context. There were no more distractions, no more emails, no more pixels to push. She reached out, her hand moving slowly, deliberately, into the pool of blue light. She didn't touch me. She touched the lid of the laptop. With a soft, decisive click, she pushed it down. The blue light vanished. Now we were lit only by the storm and the city. The darkness was intimate. A velvet curtain pulled tight around us. The barrier of work, my shield for months, was gone. "We can't work," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "The battery—" "Forget the battery," she cut in. Her voice was right there, close, stripping the air from my lungs. "The work is done. The launch is over. We ran out of excuses about an hour ago." She shifted. I heard the rustle of silk against the rug. She was moving closer. The scent of sandalwood and rain intensified, filling my senses. I couldn't see her expression clearly anymore, just a silhouette of her, the architecture of the woman who had dismantled my life, piece by piece. "You wrote something," she said. It wasn't a question. "That night, the text." "It was a mistake," I breathed, the denial automatic, a reflex of self-preservation. "No," she corrected, her voice low and raspy. "The typo was the mistake. The sentiment was the data." She paused, and I felt her breath ghost against my cheek. She was close, terrifyingly close. "You said I was your undoing." The words hung in the dark, heavy and undeniable. I felt exposed, stripped of my professional armor. "I didn't mean to send it," I whispered. "But you meant it," she insisted. Her hand found my arm in the dark, her fingers cool, tracing the line of my wrist, finding the pulse that was betraying me with its frantic rhythm. Her touch wasn't tentative. It was possessive. It was the touch of someone who had analyzed the user behavior and knew exactly where the friction points were. "You've been undoing me for months," she admitted, the confession vibrating in the space between us. "With your focus, with your restraint, with the way you look at me when I'm analyzing wireframes." She leaned in, her forehead resting against mine. The contact was electric, a grounding wire for all the static we'd built up. "I'm tired of the restraint," she murmured against my skin. "I'm tired of the interface. I want the back end." She pulled back just enough to look me in the eye, her gaze searching mine in the shadows. "You said I was your undoing," she challenged, the command soft but absolute. "Prove it." The blueprints and the dead devices were pushed aside, swept away by the sudden, necessary reconfiguration of the space between us. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. The challenge she had issued wasn't a request for data. It was a demand for a new operating system. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the permission she had just granted. My fingers brushed the line of her jaw. Her skin was cool, a stark contrast to the heat radiating off me, smooth and terrifyingly real. Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't pull back. She leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering shut, the ironclad control of the creative director dissolving into something softer, something human. It was the first time I had touched her without an excuse, without the cover of pointing at a screen or handing over a coffee. It felt like breaking a seal. When I closed the remaining distance, the kiss wasn't tentative. It was a collision. It was the release of 3 months of repressed syntax, of code written in the dark and never compiled. It was a slow, deliberate study of texture. Her lips were soft, yielding in a way I hadn't expected, a shocking counterpoint to the sharp edges of her public persona. I felt the precise texture of her intention in the kiss. It wasn't casual. It was heavy with the weight of everything we hadn't said in the glass office, everything we hadn't said in the car, everything we hadn't said across this rug for weeks. I felt her hands move, no longer resting on the laptop, but gripping the fabric of my shirt, pulling me closer until there was no negative space left. The scent of her filled my lungs, drowning out the smell of ozone and old books. It was a sensory overload, a total immersion. The storm outside battered the glass, but the only sound I registered was the sharp intake of her breath against my mouth. We shifted, the geography of the room forgotten. The professional boundaries didn't just blur, they were deleted. I felt the weight of her embrace settle over me, a silent promise that anchored us both to the floor. It was a desperate, heavy holding on, as if we were both afraid that if we let go, the lights would flicker back on and the walls would go back up. Her hands tangled in my hair, her nails grazing my scalp, sending shivers down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold apartment. "Rachel," I breathed, pulling back just an inch to look at her in the shadows. Her eyes were open now, dark and dilated, stripped of all judgment. She looked wrecked in the most beautiful way possible, her hair coming loose from its architectural knot, her lips swollen, her guard completely down. "I waited," she whispered, her voice rough, lacking all its usual polish. "I waited for you to crash." "The typo," I murmured, my thumb tracing her cheekbone. "It wasn't a bug," she admitted, a small, crooked smile touching her mouth, a smile I had never seen before. It was the only honest feature in the whole project. When I saw you panic, I knew. "You knew?" "I knew I wasn't the only one struggling to keep the interface clean." She let out a long, shaky breath, resting her forehead against mine again. "I didn't demand the meetings here because of the renovations, you know. The office is fine. It's quiet." The admission hung in the air, fragile and massive. She had engineered this. She had designed the environment, migrated the data, and waited for the user to engage. The vulnerability of it, the idea of the formidable Rachel Paul inventing a construction noise excuse just to sit on my floor, made my chest ache. "You wanted to be here," I said, the realization landing soft and sure. "I wanted to be where you are," she corrected. "I wanted to see if the system would fail, if we took away the firewall." I kissed her again, softer this time, a validation of the new code. The tension that had held my spine rigid for months finally snapped, leaving a profound, exhausting relief in its wake. We stayed there on the rug as the adrenaline crashed, leaving us heavy and slow. The darkness wasn't oppressive anymore. It was protective. It was a capsule. Eventually, the exhaustion of the launch and the emotional sprint caught up to us. We didn't move to the bedroom. That felt like a step too far, too fast. Instead, she pulled the throw blanket from the sofa down over us. We lay on the floor, tangled together in the nest of velvet and silk, the dead laptop a dark monolith beside us. The professional line hadn't just been crossed. It had been erased, scrubbed from the record. As I drifted off, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing against my neck, I realized the project was finished. But the real work, the work of us, was just beginning. The morning light sliced through the curtains, exposing the absolute reality of what we had done. I woke up stiff, and for a terrifying second, I was alone. Panic washed over me. She'd scrubbed the session, packed up her trench coat, and returned to the glass tower, leaving this as a system error she had already patched. I walked down the hallway, bracing myself for the severance package note left on the table. She wasn't gone. Rachel was in the kitchen. She was leaning against the counter, backlit by the 9 a.m. sun. She had raided my closet. She was wearing my white button-down, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, the hem hitting her mid-thigh. On anyone else, it would have looked messy. On her, it looked like high-concept fashion. She was holding the iPad in one hand and a mug of coffee in the other, scrolling through the launch analytics with the same devastating focus she applied to everything. She heard me enter. She didn't jump. She didn't cover herself. She simply looked up, her eyes clear and calm, stripping me of my anxiety with a single glance. "Retention is at 40%, she said, her voice raspy with sleep, but steady. "The crash rate is 0. I stood there, barefoot and disheveled, trying to reconcile the terrifying creative director with the woman standing in my kitchen, wearing my clothes and drinking from my chipped mug. "And the user feedback?" I asked, my voice thick. Rachel set the iPad down on the counter, ignoring the metrics. She picked up a second mug, black, no sugar, exactly how I took it, and walked over to me. She moved differently now. The sharp, predatory angles were gone, replaced by a fluid, easy grace. She stopped inches from me, the steam from the coffee rising between us, carrying the scent of a new beginning. "The feedback is overwhelmingly positive," she said softly. She wasn't talking about the app. She handed me the coffee, her fingers brushing mine, lingering. Then she leaned in and kissed me. Not the desperate, storm-driven collision of the night before, but a slow, deliberate greeting. It tasted like coffee and morning and permanence. "Approved," she murmured against my lips. The project launched 3 days later. It was a triumph. The industry press called it visionary. The client called it a game changer. Rachel and I stood in the back of the celebration dinner, watching the accolades roll in, holding glasses of champagne we didn't drink. In public, we were back to the firewall. She was the client, I was the vendor. But the encryption key had been shared. Every time she caught my eye across the room, I felt the phantom weight of her head on my shoulder, the texture of the rug, the silence of the apartment. We didn't stop the meetings. The project was done, the retainer fulfilled, but the protocol had been rewritten. Every Tuesday at 10 a.m., the buzzer still rings. Rachel still arrives, sometimes with blueprints for a new pitch, sometimes with just pastries from the bakery she likes. We still work, she on her empire, me on my contracts, but the boundaries are gone. The glass wall is shattered. My apartment isn't a workspace anymore. It's a shared server. Her blazer hangs in my closet next to the shirt she stole. Her expensive face cream sits on my bathroom sink. We navigate the transition with the same care we used for the interface, testing the edges, smoothing the friction, finding the flow. We built a new version of us, one without the glitch. The app was a success, a perfect loop of engagement and reward. But the real design achievement wasn't the code or the pixels. It was the woman sitting on my sofa right now, reading a book, her feet in my lap. Rachel looked up, catching me watching her. She smiled, and the glitch was gone. The focus I had been so afraid of wasn't a threat anymore. It was a promise. If you understand the weight of unspoken words and the risks worth taking, subscribe for more stories.